Live now?
And we are live. First of all, Anil Seth, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here. We have been reading your book, Being You, and it has just blown our minds. We'll explain why later. We have been talking about it this Friday. So before we start talking about the mind and why I don't exist, I just perceive myself existing and all of that. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. What got you interested in the science of consciousness?
That's a good question. I always find that quite hard to answer because I've always been interested in it. It seems to be, and it's not just me, right? I think many people from an early age are fascinated by these questions of who am I? Does free will exist? What happens after I die? Where was I before I was born? And how does consciousness happen? And we're given to understand, like the whole of education tells us that the world is this physical material thing, and we learn the laws of physics. We learn all these things, and consciousness seems to be this big unsolved mystery, but one that is central. It's not just a mystery that we don't understand that's on the other side of the universe. Consciousness is an everyday phenomenon. It's the most familiar thing to all of us. So there's this big mystery at the center of science and at the center of our lives. So I'm always perplexed when people are not interested in it, and
Yeah.
I don't think that happens very often. People are interested. It's just that when I was growing up and when I was at school and then university, the neuroscience, the psychology of consciousness was not really central to what we were being taught. It wasn't a really mature research area because it's quite tricky. You know, you're studying subjective experience. It's hard to get the data. But over the last 20 years, there's been a sea change. There's been a resurgence of people studying consciousness and admitting that they're studying consciousness too, saying this is what we're really interested in front and center. And I've been very lucky just to have been working at a time where that's happened and maybe contributing in a small way to it as well.
So one follow-up question will be that what was the paradigm change, or what brought this idea that consciousness could actually be explained through science?
It's always a more complicated story than we can really tell quickly, but in a sense, it's always been there. So at the beginning of neuroscience and psychology, which let's say that late 19th century, William James and so on, consciousness was really at the center of these fields. That was fairly obviously, that was a central phenomenon of mental life. But then as people got a bit wary of the methods used to study consciousness, which were at least initially mainly to do with introspection, so people just describing their experiences, what their experiences are like, that became treated as a bit non-scientific. And so consciousness became more the object of philosophy, of course, of religion and theology too, primarily because of these reservations that the objective methods of science could be applied. And then it gradually became sort of back into the orbit of psychology and neuroscience over the years. And it really started with cognitive psychology in the 1960s, where people were again talking about inner mental states and information processing in the brain rather than just behavior. Excuse me. And then in the 1990s, it changed again. And part of that, I think, was to do with brain imaging. So for the first time, many laboratories had the ability to look inside the living human brain while people were falling asleep, going under general anesthesia, all these manipulations of what people are conscious of, where you keep the sensory information the same, but their conscious perception might change. So just being able to study what happens in the brain when consciousness changes, even if you're not solving the grand mystery of how and why consciousness is part of the universe, it's something you can do. It gives scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists something they can do to at least chip away at the problem. So I think it was partly these new technologies and partly the fact that just new generations of people came in, inspired by a few pioneers who'd set themselves out as, okay, I'm going to study consciousness now. People like Francis Crick, who'd won the Nobel Prize for uncovering the structure of DNA, and my old mentor and boss, Gerald Edelman, who was also a Nobel Prize winner, also used some of the reputation that he gained from that to give some legitimacy to studying consciousness. And now there's a really lovely interaction between psychology and neuroscience and philosophy and computer science and maths that just make it, for me, it's not only an interesting topic, it's a beautifully multidisciplinary area as well. And that means there's always new things to learn, new things to discover.
I find it fascinating how like technological revolutions can really change the way we perceive the world. Like I just always think of Galileo pointing his elongated tube and changing our perception of the place we occupy in this universe. That's fascinating. So concretely, when did you jump into neuroscience? Like, was it like your first scientific passion and you just stick with it from the get-go, or was it like a windy path that got you?
It was definitely a windy path. Yeah, it was windy as well. Maybe bad weather on it too. But I originally started out studying physics because I think, like many people, when you think of the big unsolved mysteries in science and philosophy, there's this temptation to think physics has the answers because physics is the most fundamental of the sciences. And in a sense, that's still true. That's always true. Physics is the most fundamental of all the sciences. But of course, it's not necessarily the right way to ask and answer every question. Like biology and the theory of evolution wasn't derived through physics. It was derived through biology. So I started out studying physics, but then transitioned into experimental psychology by the end of my first degree. And then my PhD was actually in computer science and artificial intelligence. I was very interested in this idea that in order to understand the brain in general, let alone consciousness specifically, we needed computational models that actually mapped onto brain structures in interesting ways. A lot of psychology at the time represented brain functions in terms of boxes and arrows and nothing really detailed, nothing that mapped onto neurons and synapses and things like that. So I did a PhD in AI, but that really had nothing to do with consciousness. That was very, very useful in understanding, for instance, how simple mechanisms in conjunction with bodies and environments can give rise to complex behaviors. And there's this idea that intelligence is embodied and embedded. And so I was studying a lot of that in my PhD at Sussex. But it was really only in the postdoc, after I finished my PhD, I moved to San Diego to work with Gerald Edelman. And from then, I was really working on and thinking about consciousness as actually part of my job description. But I think the important thing is, and I think this may apply to many different academic careers, is there's often no road, there's a single road that you need to take in order to study a phenomenon. Like all the things that I've done, some of them I have barely used and can barely remember. But in as much as I've done anything distinctive, it's because there's been pieces along the way that make sense only in hindsight, that I can think of some of the math and physics that I learned early on, and then some of the computer science and AI that I learned. And just by putting these pieces together in a slightly different way gives you something new. It's Kierkegaard that said life has to be lived forward, but can only be understood backwards. And I think exactly the same applies to any academic career too.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. Why can't we say that, for example, a robot that works with an AI, for example, or just like an AI by itself, why is not that embodied? What does embodied means? Do they need a flesh blood organism, or yeah?
It's a good question. I think there's two senses, and I would have given different answers at different stages of my thinking about consciousness. In the first answer, and there's this idea in cognitive science of I think it's the 4 E's: embedded, inactive, embodied, and another one, which I can never remember what the 4th E is. But they all emphasize not necessarily the internal aspects of the body, the flesh and blood nature of it, but more how complex behavior is dependent on the body as a physical object interacting with an environment. that, and it's not all just the brain doing complicated information processing. A lot of the intelligence that we see in organisms is in the mechanics of the body, the adapted mechanics of the body. And that's the one aspect of the importance of the body. You know, the brain isn't just this thing that moves the body from meeting to meeting. And we think with our bodies, we express emotion with our bodies, and yeah, a lot of our flexible behavior is dependent on the body as an object. But then there's this other sense of embodiment, which is the flesh and blood nature, the fact that we are living machines. And this is something that I hadn't paid a huge amount of attention to until, well, the last 5 or 10 years. But if you think about it, that's what brains are primarily for. They're for keeping the body alive. And that starts inside the body. We act in the world only in order to stay alive. And so the way my thinking has developed, and I'm not the only one at all, there are many other people who've made these points, people like Antonio Damasio long before me, and others too, Evan Thompson, is that we can understand how we perceive the world around us and how brains underpin complex behaviors out there in the world only once we understand how brains perceive and regulate the interior of the body too. Everything stems from that. And certainly in my own work, I've come to sort of understand all our conscious experiences of the self and of the world as grounded in this fundamental imperative of the brain in regulating the physiology of the life status of the body.
That is really interesting what you're saying about the function of the brain to keeping alive the body, because we usually think about the mind and the brain the other way around, like it is the body's function to keep safe the mind because we identify ourselves with the mind. So what was like the evolutionary way? What was like the path that it took for us to develop and evolve minds?
Well, it depends what you mean by a mind, right? I mean, what do you think? How would you define mind in this case?
Well, that's the tricky question I was about to make. In this case, I guess I just mean the capacity of conscious experience.
Okay, we can take it like that. But I think actually it's probably, I would make a distinction. Actually, I think, you know, you can say an organism has a mind, perhaps, if it behaves in ways and not just purely reflexes in response to the environment. You know, if there's some indirectness into how something behaves, some internal states that govern the behavior of a system. So in my mind, you can think of minds without necessarily those minds being conscious. And part of that is actually, even in, you know, one of the primary methods we have for studying consciousness in humans is we compare conscious versus unconscious conditions. Mm-hmm. We can perceive stimuli without being conscious of those stimuli. So many things that happen in our own minds happen outside of the orbit of consciousness. So I do think we can separate the two. But in terms of the evolutionary trajectory, of course, with all these evolutionary questions, it's very hard to be sure, especially for things like mind, which leave no obvious fossil evidence.
Yeah.
You can look at the size of the skull or something like that. That's about it. So it's all a bit speculative. But I think there's some very nice, compelling stories to tell that at a certain point in evolutionary history, organisms transitioned from being stationary things that just fed on whatever floated by to actually moving around in the world, and in order to stay alive. And once things have to move around in the world, then the control systems that are regulating their bodies have to become a little bit more sophisticated and take in information from the world and use that to guide behavior. And I think it's at that point that you see this real explosion in the sophistication of nervous systems and the beginnings of things we might call a mind. There's I think it's the sea slug or the sea snail. I can never remember which organism it is, but there's this very simple organism, a marine mammal, that in its early stages of its life cycle, it has a very simple brain, and it swims around looking for somewhere to spend the rest of its life. It feeds on stuff that floats by. It's a filter feeder. But in the early stages of its life, it swims around, it finds a rock that it attaches itself to. And once it's found its rock, it then digests its own brain.
Wow.
Because it no longer needs to move around, so it no longer needs to have a brain anymore, which is a really lovely example of what brains in general might be for. But then the story gets much more complicated and difficult to resolve, and you have lots of different opinions. So some people would say the reason we have minds that are anything like the human minds that we're familiar with was to do with social pressures, that we're social animals, and that we have a sense of self because there was an evolutionary pressure for each organism to model other organisms as having mental states. Mm-hmm. And it's only when that sort of turned back inwards on the organism that we then interpret ourselves as having mental states, and then we have a self. And that's one extreme. And the other extreme is much more about just building up on this fundamental need to keep the body alive, and then that, and to do that well over time, you need to anticipate the future, and so then you have to predict what might happen in the future, and that could be an evolutionary trajectory towards mind as well.
Sounds a bit like the feedback on a camera, doesn't it? Because in your book you talk about these states of the world, internal states of the world we have, like models of the world we shape to move around the world. But in a social setting, we have to have not only a model of the world, but also a model of, if I understood your book correctly, also a model of how the people in the world perceive us. So we also have to have a model of ourselves within that world we are modeling. So doesn't it sounds a bit like that feedback on the camera when the camera points towards the screen where it's being shown up, and then it like goes into an infinite tunnel of feedback?
It could be. It is. I know exactly what you mean, and it's like that hall of mirrors thing as well, isn't it? Where there's mirrors, and you can stand there, and suddenly there's an infinite sequence of you just extending off into the horizon, into the distance. I don't think it has to be infinitely recursive that way, and in fact, we know it's not, right? I mean, it's very easy to so. You can just construct scenarios where it's like, I understand that you understand something about me. And if you say that, then that's fairly clear. But you add a couple more levels to that, and all of a sudden, everybody is lost. Maybe great novelists can handle it. They can handle in their mind multiple people with multiple recursive points of view refracting off each other. But for most of us, it's quite, once you get beyond like 2 or 3 levels, I believe that you believe that I believe that you believe that then I've got no idea where we are at all. So I think there are practical limits on how far this recursion actually goes. But I agree that it is a fundamental part of the human self, at least most of the time. I think there might be some conditions, might be some situations where that aspect of selfhood is less prominent. But indeed, I think I say in the book that we perceive ourselves through the minds of others as much as we perceive ourselves through our own bodies.
That's right. So one of the main ideas of the book that I found really fascinating was presenting what you call the real problem. And maybe it will be interesting if you could introduce us to that by contrasting it to the hard problem and just seeing what the difference between those ideas is.
Sure. So I think the best way to put it is that this mystery of consciousness has always been fundamentally about how you explain the mental in terms of the physical, the subjective, qualitative nature of the redness of red, the feeling of pain in terms of physical things happening in brains and bodies and in the world in general. Descartes split the universe into mind stuff and matter stuff, and that was the start of all these problems. David Chalmers then took this idea and updated it for the 20th century and coined the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And the idea of the hard problem of consciousness is that we recognize that conscious experiences are intimately connected to brains and bodies, to physical processing of some kind, but we have no idea why or how that is the case. Why and how should any physical interactions at all be associated with any kind of conscious experience? That's the hard problem. The idea is that even if we understood how brains work as mechanisms, as these complex networks of neurons and synapses and chemicals washing around, even if we understood everything about the brain as a mechanism, how it performs functions like memory, how it guides behavior in the ways we've been talking about, there would still be an additional mystery. Why and how should any of that have to do with conscious experience? That's the hard problem. And if you put it like that, it really does seem like a very, very difficult problem, which is why consciousness keeps being held up as one of these great mysteries. My approach, and it's not a new approach, I've called it the real problem to give it a specific emphasis. But the idea is simply to say that, okay, let's accept that consciousness exists, and it's a real phenomenon. Conscious experiences happen. But instead of trying to explain why and how they are part of the universe in the first place, or try and find this like magic spark that creates experience out of mere mechanism, let's just identify the different properties of consciousness and explain them somewhat individually. They're not completely independent, but let's take them one by one and explain their properties in terms of things happening in brains and bodies. And so, for instance, this is like saying, why is a visual experience the way it is and not like an emotional experience or an experience of smell or like an experience of free will? Why is visual experiences happen? They have a spatial character, objects and colors, and emotional experiences don't. They have other features. And so this is a strategy that says, let's not treat consciousness as a single big scary mystery that requires this eureka moment of a solution, but as a series of interrelated problems. And the idea and the hope is that if you address these sub-problems one by one, explain the character of each kind of conscious experience, then little by little, this apparent metaphysical mystery of the hard problem will fade away. It won't be solved directly, but it will be dissolved gradually. And the precedent for this is back to talking about life. And there was a time not that long ago where people thought life could not be explained in terms of physics and chemistry, that it had, people were looking for this spark of life, this élan vital. They were treating it as a single big scary mystery. And it didn't seem possible there could be a solution in terms of physics and chemistry. But of course, that's not what happened. Biologists, instead of looking for a spark of life, they explained the properties of living systems, and the hard problem of life was dissolved. It wasn't solved. And the hope is the same strategy will work for consciousness. I can't guarantee that it will, but I do think it's a guarantee to be a lot more productive than trying to solve the hard problem head on and getting absolutely nowhere. At least this way you'll get somewhere.
Yeah. How do you picture your results in the sense that can you map, for example, the activity of some neurons to the experience of red, and how do that vary from person to person? We have like completely different, blobs in the brain lighting up when we have some experience. Yeah, how would that look like?
I think this is a really nice way to put it, because just saying that some neurons in the brain light up when somebody experiences red is not a very good explanation, right? It doesn't give you any insight into why that's the case.
Yeah.
But it is something you can do. So that's how the neuroscience of consciousness got going. It was all about looking for these neural correlates of consciousness, whether they're brain regions or whatever. But correlations are not explanations. So what we need to do, and to paint the picture that you're asking about, is, so if we're not just talking about blobs of neurons or brain regions, what kind of properties of brain activity give us actual explanatory insight into why redness has the property that it does? And so then there are many ways to think how to do this. And my preferred way of doing this is to think of the brain as a prediction machine, that it's always making predictions about the causes of sensory inputs and updating these predictions in various ways. And then we can use the language of predictive processing, predictive coding, this process of making and updating predictions, to give us some insight into why different experiences are the way they are. And I'll give you one very simple example would be, I have this mug of tea, English, so I'm always drinking tea, in front of me. Now, my visual experience of this mug is that it has a back that I can't directly see, but I know there's a back to it. It's a three-dimensional object. That's a character of a visual experience that doesn't apply to an emotion. Like my experience of whether it's anxiety or happiness doesn't have a back and sides in the same way that a mug does. How do we explain that? Well, one way to explain it is that in the brain's visual mechanisms, part of making predictions is making predictions about how sensory data would change under different actions, like I look at the back or I rotate it. My brain is making conditional predictions about how sensory data would change when I interact with it in some specific ways. So I perceive this mug as having a back because of predictions about the sensory consequences of possible actions. And that applies in vision in a way that doesn't apply to when my brain is making predictions about the internal state of the body that underpins emotional experiences. And I don't experience where my internal organs are or what shape or color they are. But what I do experience is how well or badly things are generally going as an organism in staying alive. So it's a different kind of prediction the brain is making about the interior of the body than it is about making about the mug. And that can give us a handle on why those kinds of experiences are different from each other. And that's just a starting point, but I think it's a good, it lays out a path that we can then think about all kinds of other experiences and build models and test them and so on, do experiments from that starting point.
So related to that, I think the biggest question I was left with, or one of the many, but after your fascinating book was, and I don't know if there's an answer, but if the brain is doing these predictions about changing inputs through the ideas of like the free energy principle that you so vividly talk about in the book, like that seems to apply to every level of organization, no? So where do you transition to, like a bacteria in a, some sugar broth has to sense that and respond, and they can even have some predictions about future states, that if you have two variables that are correlated with each other. So when does that transition to saying, oh, they have an experience, or it is like something being a bacteria, meaning like, is it like a phase transition to being conscious, or how, or when do you draw the line if everything almost by definition under this idea is doing predictive coding of their experiences or their inputs?
It's a super good question, and I have to just be honest and say I don't know, and I'm not even sure it's necessarily a meaningful question. But what I would say in response to that is, it maybe encourages you to ask different things. So you're right that for all living things, whether it's a bacterium or a human being or an orangutan or a bat, there are these fundamental imperatives for persistence over time, for regulation, for keeping life processes going. In a way that's not the case for even the most sophisticated artificial intelligences that we have. Right? So you could build a robot that is very good at simulating what a human being might be like. Indeed, if we stick in the virtual world, this is basically already here, right? With things like deepfake videos and language generation programs like GPT-3. But for these simulations, whether they're robotic or software-based, there is no life process sustaining going on at all. So something could give the appearance of of being conscious, but it would not be based on the same processes that I think are fundamental to consciousness in humans. So our intuitions might change a bit there. But on your specific question of where you draw the line in systems which are alive, there are, I really don't know, and it's a very, very tricky thing to talk about, because we're necessarily guided by using humans as a benchmark. We know we're conscious. We tend to judge everything in terms of the baseline of our own existence. I don't even know that any of you are conscious, but you're sufficiently similar, and I know, I'm confident you've got similar enough brains that it would be very, very silly to infer anything else. But I don't actually know, because it's something that is intrinsically private and subjective. And as we get further and further away, these inferences become less secure. But we also know that it's a massive mistake to only judge things in reference to the human. We've made this mistake many times before. We thought we were at the center of the universe. We're not. We thought we were distinct from all other animals. We are not. And so we have to follow a strategy that we know to be fundamentally mistaken, but there's really no alternative to doing that. What we just have to do is follow it very carefully and incrementally. So for instance, by studying other mammalian brains or primate brains, we may get and making the assumption that, yes, they have conscious experiences because they're sufficiently similar, we may get a handle on, okay, what are the mechanisms underpinning consciousness in humans and mammals that are not specific to the human? And then we might be able to generalize a bit further to, let's say, birds like corvids or octopuses or something like that, and keep generalizing out. But there's no guarantee that we'll be able to do that at any particular point. And certainly my intuition is there is a point at which just being alive is not sufficient for being conscious. And part of what guides that intuition is that we can be unconscious too. I mean, there are states in which we're certainly alive, but unconscious. And so being alive is even for humans is not always sufficient for being conscious.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But so, precisely where you draw it's a very difficult question to answer.
So then would that imply, maybe this question doesn't make that much sense, but we always have this jargon of like collective consciousness, or the Gaia hypothesis of the Earth being this alive system. So it means, will it have to be like consciousness be contained in a single body, or would if it's an emergent property, could like a very, very complex ant colony somehow have some behavior that looks like consciousness kind of thing?
Looks like maybe, but I think maybe not. I think you bring up a super interesting issue here. This notion of collective consciousness has two very distinct meanings. On one meaning, there's this idea that as a group, the consciousness of each individual is changed. So there's a big difference it makes to feel like part of a group. So if I'm at a football game or something, or a music concert, whatever, it really can feel like the boundaries of myself have expanded to include the others in the group. So from the first person, it seems as though conscious selfhood has this collective component. But that doesn't mean that there is something it is like to be that group, that it feels like something to be the group. It just means that each individual feels like they are part of a group. So I certainly think that is true. So collective consciousness exists in that we can feel that we're part of a group, but that doesn't mean that the group itself is the substrate of a kind of group level conscious experience. Now, why am I suspicious of that? Well, I think it's because everything that we know about consciousness within human brains suggests that it relies on very, very sort of tight communication between brain regions in a way that just doesn't apply for separate brains, and however sort of close the collective experience is. It's almost the same as like what happens if you divide a brain into two. Then I think it's actually more plausible that you get two separate conscious entities that do become one when you combine them. But if you combine multiple brains into a group, then I think it's not impossible, but I think it's less plausible. And it depends on which theory of consciousness you subscribe to, whether you think this is going to be plausible or not. The only other thing I'd say about this, and I'm sorry to ramble on about it, is that you mentioned the concept of emergence. And I think this is really, really key. Right? Emergence is this intuition that drives a lot of these ideas, that an emergent property applies to a collective that in a way that it doesn't to the things that make that collective up. A flock of birds is more than the sum of the parts, the individual birds that make up the flock. And emergence has been applied to consciousness in so many different and usually very confusing ways. We think of like, is consciousness an emergent property of brain activity? Well, in some sense, yes, because we have a unified conscious experience that's somehow shaped by the activity of separate neurons, separate groups of neurons. So there's something non-mysteriously emergent about it, but it's often thought of as being a sort of more spooky thing. Like it emerges, it sort of comes out of nowhere with new laws of physics and new things that apply. There's no need for that kind of use of the word emergence. Another way it's often misused is saying that consciousness is emergent so that it can exercise causal power on the brain, which is what gives us free will, which is all kinds of nonsense, right? I mean, that's just thinking of consciousness again as this immaterial thing that somehow swoops in and changes things. So I think what this is actually what we're doing, and one of the things we're doing in my lab at the moment is we're trying to just get a little more specific about what we mean by emergence. Can we develop mathematical measures that actually say sensible things about when a large-scale property, like a flock of birds or the activity of a whole bunch of neurons, is emergent from its lower-level parts? And once you become more specific and mathematical about it, then you can sidestep. You avoid all these philosophical pitfalls of assuming what emergence means in these contexts, and you actually make it something that you can measure in systems and see whether it usefully distinguishes different brain states and different conscious states and so on.
You mentioned something really interesting, which is free will. What's your take on that? Are we really free entities, or are we just determined by our biological substrate? So, of course, it depends, and this is always the tricky thing. Do we? I have to say, I was at this just over a month ago. I was at a debate at the Cambridge University Union, and the subject was, does free will exist? I think, and basically there were two sides arguing against it, and I was arguing on the side that free will does not exist, and we won. The House voted on one way or the other. So based on that, we can say free will doesn't exist. You won. Just to be, it's not really a democratic thing, right? You won, but you had no choice. Exactly. Well, I think the first thing to say is that this whole issue of whether determinism is true is frankly irrelevant. People get all hung up on this, like, well, if this idea that if the universe is deterministic, then free will can't exist because everything is predetermined. Everything that
It that happens was always going to happen. So therefore no free will. This is a kind of weird way to think about free will, because it only rules out the kind of free will that makes no sense in the first place, which is a kind of free will that swoops in from another domain and changes the flow of causal physical events in the universe. A sort of dualistic, spooky, immaterial essence of soul, soul-powered nonsense that just comes in and changes things. Like, that is not the kind of free will that any of us want to, it's not, it doesn't mean anything, right? Then you go back to Descartes and immaterial souls and all that metaphysical woo-woo nonsense. That's the only kind of free will that is threatened by a deterministic universe. And if the universe is not deterministic, it doesn't matter anyway. Like chance, randomness, that's not free will either. Our voluntary actions, when we experience being the cause of things that happen, that's not just a dice is thrown and some random stuff happens. The only way, again, that randomness in the universe helps is if we think there is some soul-powered magic nonsense that comes in and takes advantage of this randomness to change things in a particular day, loads the quantum dice one way rather than the other. So I think this whole debate of stochasticity, determinism is completely irrelevant. And for me, the right way to think about free will is the same way we think about all our perceptual experiences, like our perceptual experience of color. We experience things as having colors. This mug is yellow and white. You can just about see that. We know yellowness is not an objectively existing property of the world. It's, as Locke would say, it's a secondary quality. Perception of, this object exists, it reflects light, but the experience of color is an inference the brain is making about how surfaces reflect light. Same thing goes for free will. We experience certain actions as being freely willed. Like just then, I decided to pick up this mug. That felt like a voluntary action. What does that mean? Does it mean the experience caused the action? No, that's just the content of the experience. I had an experience that had that character of that there was the agent, me, was having causal influence on the world. But I think that's just the same thing as my experience of red, right? The fact that it seems as though my experience caused the action does not mean it actually did. In exactly the same way that my experience of something as being red doesn't mean that redness exists as an objective property of the world. But it's still a useful thing to perceive. If I just think of myself as a complicated organism, some of the actions that I do originate largely from within my body over time. There was no external thing that forced me to pick up this mug. It's happened because I'm English, so I like tea, so I made tea. I put the mug there, we're having this conversation. There were many causes, but if you trace them back, they all trace back over time and remain largely within my body, my organism. And so I experience actions that have largely internal causes as being freely willed. And that's a very, very useful thing for an organism to do, to make a perceptual distinction between actions that come mainly from within and those that come mainly as a result of the external environment. Why? Because the next time a similar situation happens, it might be better to do something else. So I think that the clearest way I can put it is like one of the key aspects of the experience of free will is the feeling that I could have done otherwise.
That is a great
feeling
insight.
that I didn't have to do that, right? I could have done otherwise. Does this mean I actually could have done otherwise? No. If you replay the tape the same way, you get the same outcome. Apart from if there's randomness, you get something slightly different, but it's random. It's not interesting. But what it means is the next time I maybe could do something else. So I think the experience of free will is actually more for the future than it is for the here and now. So we do have it, but it's not what people typically think it is.
Damn. That was an amazing insight on free will. That's the first time I ever hear that take. There's this amazing part in your book where you're talking about how, well, we perceive objects as having a color and having a shape, but they're just the best guess of our brain at a, how you put it, at a colorless and shapeless input of the senses. But then you say, yeah, at the very least, we have a self-experiencing, but what if that self is just another perception too? And that just blew my mind. What is your take on the self?
It follows very, very naturally from what we were talking about, actually, that this idea that free will isn't what it seems to be. It's not some semi-supernatural causal power. It's a perceptual experience. And for me, it's part of the experience of any self, of certainly any human self. Part of what it is to be me is the collective experiences of volition, of free will that I have over time. And the same goes for the rest of the self too. And I think the key insight here is that the self is not one thing. It's not the thing that sits behind the windows of the eyes doing the perceiving, figuring out what to do next, and then doing it. Consciousness for each of us is the space of all the experiences we have. Some of those are to do with the world, and some of those are to do with the self. In fact, probably the more important for us are the ones that are to do with the self. And there are many different aspects of that. There's free will, we've just talked about. There's this social aspect, which we talked about earlier. Part of the experience of being me is how I perceive others perceiving me. That's why I have a name. My name only matters because I'm in a social context, in a social network. But then there are other parts of what it is to be any self. There's the experience of being a continuous identity over time with a set of memories. So autobiographical memories part of self. And then there are lower levels of self too. There's the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person perspective. This seems so familiar that it's easy to take it for granted, but we shouldn't take it for granted. And we know this because it can be manipulated. People have out-of-body experiences. In operating theaters, in religious ceremonies, and also in the lab, we can give people out-of-body experiences. Again, it's like the free will story. It's like the color story. If people have the experience of being outside their body, seeing themselves from a different point of view, it does not mean that their self has left the body and gone floating around. What it means is that that aspect of how we experience self, the first-person perspective, is a perception. It's something the brain is continually building. It's just doing it all the time. So we just take it for granted normally. And then at the very lowest levels of self, there are these perceptions, perceptual inferences, brain-based best guesses about the interior of the body. And this gets back to where we started. So I have emotions, I have moods. These are part of the experience of self too. And there are also different forms of perception. So for me, this concept of self, and this goes back to the philosopher David Hume, is a bundle. It's not a single thing. It's a collection of perceptual experiences that for most of us, most of the time hang together. And so we tend to think of them as necessarily unified and that there is this essence of self somehow at the center of it.
Yeah.
But we know from psychiatry and neurology and all these things, these aspects of self can come and go and we can tease them apart in the lab. And for me, the underlying principle is that they are all different kinds of perception. And that's the way to understand every aspect of every self.
So with techniques, I was just thinking of what do we know about, for example, Olympic level meditators like Buddhist monks? Like, what is their experience? What changes? Do they emphasize some of these consciousness, I guess, axes or dimensions more than, or what happens in their brains?
I mean, stuff happens in their brains. It's been a really interesting collaboration over now almost 2 decades, pioneered by people like the Chilean neuroscientist Francisco Varela, and now the Mind and Life Institute that bring together, as you say, Olympic level meditators with Buddhist scholars and mindfulness practitioners and neuroscientists. And recognizing that a lot of these insights are shared. So a lot of the insights that, let's say, some of these Eastern traditions have emphasized, that the self is not this permanent essence, it's always changing, and it doesn't really exist in the way we think of it. Very, very similar to the story I've been telling from this neuroscience, brain-based best guessing perspective. And what meditation can give you is that recognition from the first person. Now, I'm not an Olympic level meditator. I do meditate, but I'm, I don't know, a run in the park level meditator, rather than Olympic level meditator. But speaking to Olympic level meditators and reading some of the work that's been written, it does seem that meditative states can reveal in the first person that the self is not the recipient of perceptions, that the self is another kind of perception, and that all there is just the flow of conscious experience over time. I think that the confluence is remarkable. What's happening in the brains of people in these states is a very different question, a very interesting question. And then you get into things like, okay, you have things like the default mode network in the brain, which seems to be normally more active when people are explicitly thinking about themselves or reflecting on self-related processes. You know, that changes in meditative states. You see the changes in different brain rhythms that seem to happen in meditative states as well. But I think there's at the moment, there's not really, and this is a little out of my area of expertise, there's not a great consensus about what happens in the brain during meditation. But it's very fascinating area to look at.
It's very interesting because it brings like to me some paradoxes. Just like, you know, like I know that Copernicus tells us that we're not the center of the universe, but but I still see the sun coming out on one side and the other side. It's not because I got that knowledge. I just like feel that I'm rotating myself. No, the same with your book. Like it just blew my mind, and it's like, oh, all these perceptions. But it doesn't, like, at the core change my experience. I know, or I want to believe that that's the case, but I just don't know how to imagine them figuring that out. And if they feel that the self is not, you know, some fixed thing, who was the one who got that insight? Like, it's just like,
yeah, yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's true that none of this, I think it just adds to our everyday experiences, right? It's as you put it from the Copernicus thing, that yes, we understand from Copernicus that it's the sun rotating on its axis that gives us night and day, not the sun rotating around the earth. But then, you know, we get up and the sun still rises in the east and it still sets in the west. But there is a sense in which we can experience both things at the same time. You know, I can experience that happening, but I can also have an understanding and experience it in a slightly different way too. Sometimes you can experience like, oh yeah, I mean, I feel this on at night when you see the stars more than the sun. And sometimes then it can feel indeed like, yeah, it's the world turning. And I think the same thing goes for how we understand conscious perception too. So the fact that there's a deeper story, a mechanistic story about, for instance, how we perceive color, doesn't mean that I no longer perceive colors. Of course, I look at this, I still see it as yellow and white, and I still experience these colors as really existing out there in the world, even though I know they don't. So it adds to it, doesn't destroy it. My brain is wired in that way. I will always experience colors as being really existing properties in the world. I will always experience free will. You know, I'm still going to have that experience. That's built into my biology. But there's this additional layer now, which I think neuroscience can give you and meditation can give you in different ways. Probably psychedelics can give you in different ways too. That we can still experience colors as existing and also experience them as the constructions they really are. Yeah. And it's, for me, the challenge in my everyday life is bringing these things together. How can I experience at the same time things as they always have been and things as I now understand them to be?
Yeah, that is so fascinating. I wanted to ask you, how human are you, in the sense that how far can we take this idea of the bundle? Like, for example, to our conception of space or time. Like, had I, been born without any kind of way to sense the exterior, but it's still, is a space for me still 3D? Like, the space is fundamentally three-dimensional, for example,
Right.
or yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting question. That there's what, and maybe another way to put it is, but I think there's two things going on in the question you ask kids. Like, how far down the rabbit hole can we go? So is our experience of space as three-dimensional a construction in the same way that redness is a construction? Is our experience of the flow of time a construction in the same way as our experience of redness construction? This is, for me, the super exciting frontier of this way of thinking, and I don't know the answers. It raises some very interesting questions. There are some things that, for instance, time, we experience the flow of time is not because we've got a clock in the head, and we don't even have time sensors. There are no sensory receptors that detect time passing, yet we experience time passing and we experience durations. So what is going on? I think there's on the one hand, and this is work done by my colleague at Sussex, Warwick Roseboom, that we can understand our experience of duration as another kind of perceptual best guess. But there are still lots of open questions there about how does that experience relate to what time really is at the level of fundamental physics, when nobody agrees what time really is anyway at that level of fundamental physics. And again, we experience the world as basically three spatial dimensions. Could we experience it otherwise? Probably not. Probably at the scale at which we exist as organisms, that three-dimensionality is the way the physical world manifests. And so any brain that's geared towards interacting with that environment will experience it as being that kind of 3+1 dimensionality. But again, exactly how that interfaces with whatever dimensionality is really at the level of fundamental physics, again, very, very difficult to say because nobody knows what that is. But the important qualification here is that not everything is mind dependent. So I've talked a lot about colors, right? Now, colors are mind dependent. Colors do not exist as objective properties of the world. They only exist in the relation between a mind and a world. But that's not true of everything. And I think it was, again, Locke who made this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Color is a secondary quality, like the experience of volition as well, I think, requires a mind as well as a world. But other things like solidity and volume don't require a mind. If I walk out in front of a train, it's going to hurt regardless of whether I'm looking at it. That property of motion and solidity is not something that exists. But if I look at the train, the way the train appears to me in my conscious experience and the way it appears to move, that's always a construction. That's always dependent on a mind.
So to be very respectful of your time, I think we have reached the 1 hour mark. Maybe just to close up, there's a lot of the audience from Pepe's channel is young and looking for what can they do with their lives or anything. So if they were interested in these kind of questions, you already told us your path, and obviously every path is unique, but what set of skills should they develop in order to tackle these questions later on?
This is a really good question. I mean, firstly, I just have to say that, I found it this really huge privilege to be able to continue to be interested and work on these questions that captivated me from so young. And so one thing that I think, looking back now, was not letting go of those things that I was originally interested in. It's very easy to, I think, get diverted into what seems to be more near term, more feasible, and there's value in doing that too. Sometimes you've got to do stuff. You've got to get a job. You've got to get paid. You've got to live. But if there's a big question that got you going in the first place, don't forget about it entirely. Don't worry about it if it's not what you're doing at this precise moment. There may well be ways back into it, whether it's in a year or 5 years or 10 years. So just that's one thing. I think keep the big picture in your mind at some level. Don't forget why you're in the game in the first place. Curiosity is the most important thing. And then in terms of like skills and so on, yeah, these are important, right? You've got to have the tools to do the job. And this is where I think young people, the next generations, have the advantage. There are already many things that people in my lab can do that I just can't do. You know, I can't do anymore. I just rely on them having the skills and the talents and knowledge, and to actually do the maths, do the modeling that I can't do. I do think in the trajectory that neuroscience and research into consciousness is going, having some background in maths, physics, computer science, the ability to code is important, is increasingly important. It's not the only thing though, you know. I just think you've also got to be open to, you know, you've got to know your background philosophy, you've got to, so you can understand the right questions to ask, know how statistics work, so you can realize that 90% of the papers published don't really mean anything. The one thing you don't have to do is read everything. So that's the one thing, like, don't, you know, there is no need to read that. You know, of course you should read my book, but you don't need to read everything. Not just the book. But don't get put off by this like idea that there's a million papers out there. How could I ever contribute? That really doesn't matter. You know, that the new stuff is always at the fringes, always at the frontiers. So you will be able to contribute. And, you know, it's a real, I think it's a wonderful way to spend a life.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredible privilege. I cannot thank you enough, and I think I speak for everyone that can tell you their version, but your book has really changed in not only the questions that I'm pursuing in my own research, but the way I perceive myself. I changed my own perception. So thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Un placer para mí también. I'm very, very grateful. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for such provocative questions and discussion. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And we'll be looking forward to the Spanish version of the book, right?
Claro que sí. Yo también. No sé cuándo, pero ya nos pusimos. Vamos a ver. Thank you.
That's perfect Spanish.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Gracias. Adiós.
So, wow.
Nunca había escuchado esa versión del libre albedrío, pero es la que más sentido tiene hasta ahora.
Tiene mucho
sentido. Siento que tiene como definiciones concretas acerca de cosas de las que a veces hablamos, pero no como medio vagas, así de qué es conciencia, qué es mente. Él tiene exactamente, a ver, es esto y vamos a entenderlo de esta forma. Y eso está bien chido.
Sí, operacionaliza todo, así de que, emergencia. Sí. No, tiene artículos hablando de métricas para cuantificar qué significa eso. Conciencia, lo mismo. Libre albedrío es pura probabilidad bayesiana.
Sí, esa respuesta fue una chulada realmente, porque es cierto, ¿no? O sea, como pensamos en el libre albedrío como de esta forma que ni siquiera tiene sentido. Y bueno, no sé, es increíble, muy súper fresco. ¿Qué edad tienes? Joven, ¿no? Tiene como 40, 50 años.
Anil tiene 49 años.
Sí, no manches.
Lo se ve muy joven.
Sí. Pues seguimos en la transmisión, ¿verdad?
Seguimos transmitiendo.
Sí,
pero nada, me gustó mucho el mensaje final. O sea, para la banda que está escuchando y igual no entendió, era como creo que es el mismo mensaje que nos dio Sean Carroll. Nunca se olviden del big picture, nunca se olviden del gran panorama, de las preguntas que son realmente importantes.
Y Jeffrey West también nos dijo eso.
Tenía algo... Está bien,
Sí,
me gusta que es el eje común de todas estas personalidades.
sí,
Ah,
eso de no olvides por qué entraste al juego, ¿no? Don't
Ajá.
forget the game. Muy importante, incluso ¿no? Como practicante de la ciencia puedo ver que no es lo más común. Entonces, no, increíble, qué gran privilegio y pues al que siga, el siguiente book club, ¿no? Ahí para que sigan estos increíbles, transformativas pláticas.
Oye, sí, ¿qué vamos a leer después de esto? Para avisarle a la banda y que ya vengan leídos.
Pues ese de los árboles estaría chido para ver cómo se comunica eh, el bosque. Igual y podemos intentar contactarla. Eh, Está ese de las matemáticas de la biblioteca de Borges. Igual y lo discutimos offline y le comunicas a la audiencia
Yo
para
estoy
que
feliz con cualquiera de los dos. Los dos se ven chingones.
va, pues igual lo ponemos en la votación, que también Dani ya va a regresar y que se vengan leídos para estas pláticas.
que
Sí.
se vengan, pero leídos.
Sale,
A
pues.
huevo, no, pues ahí está banda para que sepan que
Sí,
la
busquen.
realidad no les menciono.
Y que busquen las TED Talks de Anil Seth. Su principal tiene subtítulos en español y nos dijo que el libro, o sea, que está como el contrato y lo van a traducir, no sabemos cuándo, pero en cuanto salga sí hay que darle promoción en tus redes porque sí, vale, sí es de esos libros cambia vidas.
Sí, estaría bueno. Y a ver si conseguimos otra charla, ¿no? Ya que salga el libro para anunciarla. Estaría interesante porque yo también me quedé con muchas, muchas dudas de este libro.
Sí, sí, sí es de esos que a lo mejor hay que leer múltiples veces.
Ujú. Pues sí,
Pues, vale, pues.
ya lo
Huevo,
saben,
amigos,
chavos.
muy chingón.
No olviden el gran panorama. Gracias por escucharnos esta tarde de lunes ya, ¿verdad? Que se siente como sábado.
Sí, lunes. Y pues que nos vemos el próximo año en los book clubs, que es nuestra contribución en este canal.
Ahí nos veremos. Buenas tardes, amigos. Bonitas fiestas.